Welcome to Mid-Level Adventurers, a podcast where non-experts talk about the things they love. I'm Jarrod, and with me for this first series, as always, is my co-host, Matt Morris.
Hey everyone, it's Matt Morris.
Throughout this first series, we have discussed player options, monsters, and even resources for Dungeons & Dragons. We have talked about character building, ability modifiers, and our first D&D games. This week, we are going to talk about dungeon mastering. What is it like to DM? What tips or tricks do we have? And how do you even get started DMing? And we're going to talk about that and more, and we're going to change up the format a little bit. So since I am the one who has all of the dungeon mastering experience out of this duo, Matt is going to ask me questions, and I'm going to expound upon them.
I'll follow the bullet points and we'll get going. So, first is, what is dungeon mastering, or DMing as I have recently taken to calling it? What does it entail, and how did you get started?
Simply put, dungeon mastering is running the game of D&D, Pathfinder, or whatever game you happen to be playing, and revealing how the world reacts to the player's choices within the game. That is what I feel to be the most basic level of how to explain what dungeon mastering is.
Yeah.
As the dungeon master, you have to figure out how the world works, what are the rules of the world that the players are going to be in, and you have to have a pretty decent handle on the rules of the game. Now, you don't need to know them all, like you don't have to have the player's handbook and the dungeon master's guide all memorized. Nobody does. That's what the books are for. As for me, I've been DMing almost exclusively for a little over 10 years, I think, at this point. My best friend and I started talking about D&D one day because I had played it back in college, and I don't think he had, if I remember correctly, and I think he kind of regretted that he never really got to play. But we decided to try and get some people together, and I kind of reluctantly agreed to DM, although I kind of was hoping he would take up the mantle so I could just play.
Oh, dang.
I agreed to do it, and I was horrible. I was such a disaster.
Oh.
You know, it was 4th edition, so it was a totally, completely different version from what I had played before anyway, because I started in 3.5. But I bought the 4th edition handbook and did all this research and was like, okay, I'm going to do this thing. Oh, I was so bad. I was so bad. I killed everybody in the first game.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and I had to have like a god intervene and be like, well, since you were doing something to help me out, you can come back to life at half hit points.
Oh, okay.
So I was like, oops.
Yeah.
But not only that, I also had this really cool character design that I really wanted to play. So I was playing a character and DMing, which is like the ultimate DM sin in my mind at this point.
Oh, yeah. That's got to be way too difficult to try to manage that, and you're keeping up with, all this information for your other players.
Oh yeah, just the action economy by itself, because I have to go through all the monsters and all the players and then my own player character.
Mm-hmm.
Plus I had to be really conscientious of the fact that I couldn't just be like, oh, my character takes all the cool loot, or like I only make loot specifically that my character can use, because that's just a big jerk move. Nobody wants to play with that guy.
No, definitely not. So it sounds like sort of the gist of it is, you as the DM have an idea. Maybe it's your own, or maybe you're running a module, right? Something you're presenting to a group of players, a quest in a world. On top of that, as you run, you help guide them through it, through the encounters that they may have. You have to, come up with encounters, right? I'm guessing, because this every session's going to have something new, and be able to make some calls, some referee calls and rules, right?
Yeah, there are definitely, what are called random encounters, which is like, okay, the players have gone off through the woods. There's official, percentile chances of them running into some sort of creature based on the environment that they're in.
Mm-hmm.
They're walking through the forest, they may get ambushed by goblins or a centaur or something else. And then knowing the likelihood of that, or just guessing, or just using an online tool to help you with it, anyone is fine. You can have a list that you've made up, like, okay, here's the list of this. And if you're running a module, the module probably will tell you, if they go to this area, there's a 1 in 8 chance that they'll run into one of these creatures.
Oh, very cool.
Wizards, when they put out modules, is really good about that kind of stuff normally. You could also totally ignore random encounters and just only stick to story beats and specifically planned encounters, either in the module or in your own homebrew storyline. It's all in how much you want to play. If you're playing a milestone version, which is where you play without the use of explicit XP, then you don't really need random encounters at all if you don't want to. In milestone, you can just stick to story beats, and when they complete a story beat, you can have them level up.
Yeah, they're both great formats. Haven't seen both. So here's a question. Speaking of encounters, how much do you try to plan for the unexpected, right? So obviously you want to plan what the story beats are, or the quest line, or whatever that is, and you want to help guide the players in that direction. But inevitably, right, they're going to make certain choices. They're going to stray from certain things. And I'm
Yeah.
not only talking about random encounters, I'm talking about when they suddenly decide to go talk to this guy at the tavern instead of the guy over there that was kind of who they should talk to. How much do you plan for that? And how much do you just kind of wing it?
Well, the truth is you can't plan for everything. Every game, as soon as players get involved, throw your plans out the window. Sun Tzu said no battle plan survives the first contact with the enemy. DMing is the same thing. No game plan survives first contact with the players. Seriously, it will be a simple, okay, they're going to go into the tavern, they're going to talk to the bartender's going to know this stuff. But they won't ask the bartender anything. Instead, they'll be like, who's interesting around? And then you just make people up.
Yeah.
And you try to make like a couple interesting things just because otherwise, there's no one else in the tavern is really boring.
Yeah.
There's one guy passed out at a table over there, and there's two women talking in that booth over there, and there's a tiefling with one horn over there. You know, anytime you say anything like a tiefling with one horn or a gnome with one green eye and one black eye, they're going to draw to that character because like, oh my God, that's obviously important.
Yeah.
Nope, just spitballing. And
I've heard that before.
so then all of a sudden I got to make up a backstory for this guy on the fly.
This is what I love about like listening to DM stories, though, because this is not the first time I heard someone say, and I accidentally said oddly specific characteristics about this thing. So immediately they went to that. Well, this does lead me sort of to my next question, though, which is how much homework has to go into each session? And because of that, how much of that is story beats that you are preparing for, and how much is, maybe just like, oh, well, if they happen to have this encounter, I'll have this in my back pocket?
That's a good question. Roughly, the answer is however many hours you think the session is going to be, you should put in roughly that amount of prep time. So if you're going to anticipate a 3-hour session, put in 3 hours of work.
Okay.
And that doesn't mean you have to plan like what the enemy's battle strategy is. Just be like, okay, I know that these goblins are protecting this thing in this temple that has been underground for 35 years. So why are they protecting it? What would they have in place in order to protect it? But in terms of things that I personally plan out, I plan out like the big part of the story. So for example, in my home game that I play with my best friend and my roommate and a couple other friends, they were going into a city sewer system to track down a devil cult. I did not anticipate them just diving into the sewers and starting searching. I had left other breadcrumbs for them to follow that they totally didn't get, totally ignored and bypassed and just said, nope, we're just going into the sewers to look. Okay. I had always planned for the devil cult to be in the sewers, but now I had to figure out how would they pick up a trail in the sewers to a devil cult when they're nowhere near where the cult would be. So it became a series of checks and skill challenges, and eventually they found or heard someone running in a direction, and so they followed that person for a little while and found their way there.
Okay. That answers another question, and I might be getting ahead of myself. I know we've sort of saved a tips section for the end. Yeah, it does beg the question sometimes when you're having to adapt to things. When and how do you make certain calls for this is now an investigation check or this is a whatever? And it sounds like that if you need to help guide them, maybe you open it up to the players, right? Like, someone, make a perception check, and maybe they notice a clue.
Yeah, there's nothing that kills the forward momentum of a game more than the players just not really knowing what they're supposed to do. Because I try not to railroad people into, okay, you have to go this way. So I try to throw them something. And depending on the result of the check, it may lead to where they are trying to go. Or I may have just decided to throw them a red herring.
Yeah.
The player who made the investigation check to try to find the devil cult in the sewers happened to be the one who, in his backstory, loved maps, was a map maker, trained in cartography tools, had previously asked about acquiring city maps for the city that he was in. So based on all of that, the DC for him to make the check was significantly lower than if other people had made that check.
Okay.
That's kind of the things that you kind of run with. You're like, well, what are the characters good at? Just because the bard might have rolled a 19 and the cartographer rolled a 14 doesn't mean that the bard would know more about it than the cartographer, because for the cartographer, the DC might be a 12, but for the bard, it might be a 22.
Yeah. That actually, next question. What are the rules for those checks? Is there like a base? I actually don't know this at all. Is there like a baseline? Everything starts at 10 and then you adjust it based on how likely each character would
So there is no like official rule for anything like that. There is a rough guideline in the DMG, which is the Dungeon Master's Guide. And that guide is 10 is easy,
Okay.
15 is moderate, 20 is very difficult, or 20 is difficult, 25 is very difficult, and 30 is impossible.
Gotcha.
That is like the rough guide.
And then you might make judgment calls based on an individual character's abilities.
Right. And as people level up, they may encounter more difficult challenges.
Oh, okay.
For example, if they are delving into an old ruin at level 5, a DC or difficulty class or difficulty check.
Thank you. I was going to ask, yeah.
Yeah. So a difficulty check of a 15 investigation might reveal a hidden passageway. But if they're level 15 and traveling through an archmage's citadel that is very well kept up and very well cleaned and maintained, a DC 15 probably won't reveal much of anything.
Fair.
So it's all about environment and level and the characters you have. If you don't have any characters who are good at investigation, then the DCs have to either be lower or the DCs have to be different, or you have to come up with different creative solutions. And a lot of that aspect of dungeon mastering comes specifically from experience.
Yeah.
Just, okay, I have known from my past experience that these kind of characters are better at this than at that. So how can I help them to succeed without just handing them the game on a silver platter? Because if you don't have any challenge in the game, I don't feel like players enjoy it as much.
Yeah, that's fair. That's very fair. And if it's too challenging, I'm sure that's a turnoff as well.
Right, yeah. If you're making a new character every 3 sessions,
yeah,
then you're going to get uninvested fairly quickly.
And, I think it's fair to say, too, that sometimes players don't always make the best choices. And I'm not insulting anyone's intelligence, but you don't know how people are going to, react to certain situations. And because everything happens in the moment, me as a player, I've had this happen so many times. I'll go through a session and then at the end of it go, here's the thing that I probably should have done way back when, and I might not have been knocked unconscious.
Yeah, you make a decision based on whatever information you have at the time and how you're feeling and how stressed you are about what's going on as a player. That impacts the choices you make. And yeah, there have been a lot of times where my players have made a choice and I'm like, okay.
Yeah, a little tough love has to come into play too. This leads right into the next one, though. So what are some attitudes of DMs? We'll take a step back and talk maybe in general terms here. Yeah, responsibilities even.
Well, I think DMs should be those kind of people who want to tell a story but aren't bound by a limited narrative. You can run a module like Waterdeep Dragon Heist, but you need to be aware that the players will never do what you think they are supposed to do because the players haven't read the module, or at least if they have, they should play as if they haven't.
True.
So you as the dungeon master, you need to be willing to improvise and adapt the game as needed, which means you might have to change things around that are in the module or things that you had planned out. Improvisation becomes a really big part of dungeon mastering. And if you're someone who isn't willing to do that, if you are the kind of person who's like, no, you have to play this game my way, you're probably going to discover that people leave your game quicker than they would other games, I think.
Yeah, or don't come back.
Right. I think it's very rewarding to kind of create a scenario for players to overcome and drop threads in for a larger narrative. For example, early on in my home game, they investigated a farming town that was having problems producing crops. And they found out that there were all these what are called blight creatures, which are just like animated plants that actually can think for themselves. They're not just controlled.
Oh.
And they were created by these 2 corrupted druids. And those 2 druids had a note on their person. And they just kind of passed it off for a while. But then they learned that, there were similar things happening in other parts of the country. And they have since learned that the mysterious figure named V, who has signed that note, might be a noble that they've been interacting with. But they're not sure. They're just now at level 8, kind of getting a glimpse that maybe we know who this guy is.
Well, that's intriguing.
Yeah.
Is it a clue? Is it a red herring? You have to, investigate further.
I mean, it could be a clue, or it could be a red herring.
I think a danger maybe of players, and we touched on this a bit earlier, is attaching yourself to the wrong things maybe and taking everything as a clue or not. But I guess that's another, joy of being a dungeon master.
It is. For example, I have learned that, I have one particular player who will attach onto any interesting sounding NPC at all because he's playing a bard and the bard wants to chat up everybody who's interesting.
Sure.
Which is totally fair. And that doesn't mean I'm not going to make interesting sounding characters for them to do it. It just means that I have to be aware that they're going to want to talk to that person.
Yeah, it's one of those where you probably should be careful when you're spitballing, just describing people, huh? If you don't want to derail something too much.
Right. And in regards to this scenario that I've mentioned, this druid note was found way back in one of their earliest encounters. And whether you are crafting a world, be it homebrew or your interpretation of Faerun or Greyhawk, making something for your players to come back to because they're invested in and because they enjoy it is going to be far more rewarding, even if it is a bit of a responsibility.
So, speaking of, what are some joys of being a dungeon master? Some sorrows and regrets? We'll start with the joys. So what are the things you enjoy most?
Definitely, I like when my players overcome something, and not just like, oh, they beat the monster, but when they do it in a way that I never would have thought about. Because, people think differently. They problem solve in very different ways depending on who you are as a person. So when my players come in and I think it's a straightforward solution and they can't find that solution, they make up their own, and there's no reason why that couldn't work. So I get really excited when they overcome an obstacle like that. I also really like when they enjoy an experience or an encounter or a session that I put effort into in order to entertain them and make sure they have fun with the game.
Yeah, sounds like you're sharing the joy. If they thoroughly enjoy the encounters or overcoming puzzles, obstacles, or bosses, then yeah, I imagine that is a nice payoff, especially now knowing how much time really goes into a session. It's a lot of homework.
Yeah, and it can vary. Like if you plan for a 3-hour session and you put in 3 hours of work, they may only do like an hour of the stuff you actually had prepped for and then spend another 2 hours talking to various people in the tavern. So it becomes this ridiculous role play night,
Sure.
Which is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
That means that, okay, you still have those 2 hours you're already prepped. So maybe you only do another hour of prep the next week.
Yeah.
What I would recommend is don't prep too far in advance. Have like the big story beats, like, okay, eventually this moment will happen.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps they get there in time to stop that event, and perhaps they don't. For example, in the campaign that we're playing now is taking place 20 years after the previous campaign that we played in. They were questing for the main eye of a beholder because they had been contracted to do so by this figure that they ran into. That figure needed it for a ritual to perform to empower his leader. That leader, in the 20 years since the last game, has gone on to conquer an entire nation, and so now he has installed himself as the new warlord of that nation, renamed the nation.
Oh, wow.
It changed the political landscape of the entire world, let alone that continent.
Yeah, and these are the same players, right? So they're there's some certain things they're familiar with, but obviously new things.
Yeah, in fact, a few characters from that other game have popped up, actually.
That's nice. That's got to be fun and again, rewarding for the players. So on the flip side, how about some regrets of DMing maybe? Or sorrows, or, just things not your favorite?
As for regrets, my biggest ones are my own errors as a dungeon master more so than anything else. Not necessarily in like, oh, I called that rule wrong, or, oh, we had this bit of a tiff, but more in how my own thinking has been too restricted in the past. I often look back to my first few sessions. I ran an intelligent NPC in a very foolish way, and it caused some strife in that first games, and it was just me not understanding how I should be dungeon mastering. But I'm always learning, and I'm always watching other people dungeon master and like learning from them too. My Waterdeep Dragon Heist campaign, where I'm a player, is run by one of the guys who is a player in my home game. So I learn stuff from watching him be a dungeon master, just as much as I learn from watching Critical Role and Matt Mercer or watching Total Party Chill and Devin. Yeah,
I think that's important to recognize that experience is going to make you better as you go. You've got to keep learning. That's kind of the point of this, right? The whole mid-level adventuring podcast is we're always getting better. A fun little segment we like to do here on Mid-Level Adventurers is the Tavern Corner, where we journey on over to the tavern and we talk about what we are imbibing tonight. Jarrod, you're first tonight. What are you imbibing?
I actually am drinking tonight a Five Boroughs Brewing Company Summer Ale.
Ooh, I like me some Five Boroughs.
Yeah, I have been kind of venturing into the local New York City breweries lately.
Yeah.
And this summer ale, I was like, it's the end of summer. Sure, I'll go for it. I like a nice golden ale anyway. In a weird way, it is both a little bit more hoppy than I would have thought, but also a little crisper as opposed to just bitter.
Ah.
It has notes of grapefruit on the front end.
Oh, nice.
Which is a little weird.
Oh, yeah. It might be a little weird if you're expecting like a golden ale.
Yeah, but not unenjoyable either. But
Okay.
that tartness and crispness on the front end help balance the bitterness on the back end. So it's actually really good, and I'm enjoying it more than I thought I would when I first took a swig of it.
It is one of the things that we've mentioned before is some of the like craft brewers like to do a little spin on the normal, what you expect of certain beer styles, which can be really exciting sometimes, and I imagine sometimes it can be disappointing. But yeah, I've had some of their stuff before, and I haven't had it all, but what I've tried I liked.
Yeah, I really enjoy this one. It is made, of course, down in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn, yeah.
Yeah, at Five Boroughs Brewing Company.
One of these days I want to check out the brewery. I've seen several in Brooklyn, but they're a little down there. They're a little out of the way.
What are you imbibing tonight, Matt?
Well, I am imbibing 6 Point, so I think we've mentioned them in the past.
Yes, I had their Pilsner, I believe.
Yeah, I did threaten to bring up one of their IPAs, and so that's what I'm doing tonight. Bengali. It is sort of their flagship IPA. And I think I misspoke in a previous episode where I was trying to think of, they've got a couple of flagships that have become like a staple in some New York bars. Bengali is one, and it is an IPA. The other one I was trying to think of is called Sweet Action. And I think I was trying to say it was a blonde or something. It's in fact a pale ale. So, my mistake. Sorry if anyone was led
You
astray
will
by
never
that.
be forgiven for this transgression.
I'm sure they have a blonde ale, but if they do, I don't know what it is. But no, Bengali's good. It's just a very solid, not too out there IPA, which I appreciate. They have some other ones that go in some very strong directions for hop flavors, and I find this one very flavorful. But it is a good solid IPA if you don't want to venture too far out into hopland, I guess.
Yeah, I almost bought the Bengali the other week.
But I will warn you, if you're not a huge fan of IPAs, it might still come off a little strong.
Right.
Because it is flavorful, I think. But yeah, it's definitely probably their milder option on their IPA. I enjoy it. They're good. Yeah, again, a good local brewery. I have not been to them either. They're a little down there, but one day I would like to. Thanks for joining us at the tavern. That's what we're imbibing tonight.
I think the other big regret that I have is when I have failed to kind of keep harmony in the group, or I haven't actively strove for harmony, because we've had players fall out of the group because of a variety of reasons, or sometimes players will get uppity with each other. And so I try to do a little 5 or 10 minute post-game chill, like let's talk about what happened, everybody's still cool. And for the most part, that has alleviated the problem. So I like to do a little check-in after the fact.
Yeah, I think that's good. A lot can happen with players. I imagine trying to manage that is not always easy.
No, because, it's 4 to 6 personalities plus your own.
Correct.
Even if you're all friends, doesn't mean everyone's going to like everybody's answer. Or, someone might get triggered by something in the game, which is why a lot of dungeon masters will employ like an X card, which is either a phrase that you can throw out or a physical card that you can just throw out and be like, nope, we're stopping this conversation in this part of the play now, and we're moving forward. Which is really good, especially if you are using tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons as a mental health tool, which a lot of people are doing these days.
Yeah. Those are great. Those are not terrible regrets, right? So you still enjoy to DM, obviously.
I do. I guess another big regret is that I feel like I never have enough time to do everything I want to do. I mean, I spend hours on my computer writing up scenarios, but I don't want to get too far ahead because I don't want to come up with this great thing that I love and have it never show up.
So I'll give you a regret as a player then. When players as a party choose not to go a direction, in the back of my mind I think, I hope that was only like 30 minutes of work that DM put in for that alternate choice that we didn't do.
That's why I like to say, do broad strokes. Don't worry about details until you're like sure that they're going to go this way or do this thing.
Yeah, that's a very good tip. So what are some questions that you should ask of a DM if you are maybe a first-time player or a returning player if it's a new campaign? Where do you start?
I think it is important to ask your DM what sort of a world you will be playing in. Will it be the Forgotten Realms? Is it going to be homebrew? What's the level of magic? Is there high magic, low magic? Is there no magic? Is it highly explored? Is it almost entirely wilderness and unknown wildlands? Get just a general feel for how the world functions and where your character may come from within it and how they fit into it. For example, when we were making Newly Forged, you came to me and were like, hey, I'm thinking of playing a Tortle cleric. Where would a Tortle come from? And so we talked about that. We had that discussion.
Yeah. I imagine certain players may need more than others, right?
Right. For example, Sarah, who is playing Caerly, had a very specific idea for the kind of environment that she came from. If you're running homebrew, you can just easily insert whatever you need wherever you need it, or alter what exists, or adapt to player input. Because I don't have all the best ideas. Sometimes my best ideas come from what players throw out.
Yeah.
Tanner, for example, has thrown out a very interesting character backstory and history that I would not have thought of. So he always knew he wanted to be a Horizon Walker Ranger, which is very heavily influenced on other planes of existence. So I knew I would have to have that as an aspect in the game, even though I originally wasn't thinking that I would. But because it was such a cool character option, you got to go with it.
Yeah.
So I've now incorporated those things into the game world.
Yeah, it sounds like some good give and take. I'm notorious as a player, I think, at this point, for being very general, saying, I just kind of want to play a Tortle.
Yeah.
You know, where do we go from there? And so I think it's great to maybe expect those type of players. And if you have some strong ideas about your world, then you can help like, oh, well, you know, they would live on this continent or this part of the world. I think it's great to also have those with strong ideas that, I don't want to say force you, but allow you to, like you said, to tweak some of your own ideas. Because I think that probably makes for a much more interesting campaign when you've got that kind of connection with players. They've added a little bit of their own to it.
Yeah, I've noticed that when a player sees something that they thought of as integral to their backstory or a part of the world that they grew up in, when they see that come to fruition, when they see that little bit of, you know, a spice in the world, they get really excited about it.
It sounds like questions are good then.
Oh, absolutely.
And there's no set rule for how many you should ask or what you should expect as a DM, but that probably varies depending on how much that player wants to work with you.
Yeah, as a DM, you should encourage your players to ask questions so that they can come feeling like they are ready to play the game.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And especially if they have any mechanics questions ahead of time, like, oh, I know that I have this ability as a tiefling, but what does that mean? How do I use that? If you can explain that ahead of time, then one, it doesn't bog down the session having that mechanical conversation, and two, it lets them come feeling more in control of the character that they created and want to play.
Glad you mentioned that, because I was about to add, outside of backstory, I'm sure, especially for new players, or a player who's playing a new class, those questions probably come up a lot. Understanding the mechanics, or maybe even asking about how you view the ruling of certain things if something is kind of flagged as being, I don't want to say controversial, but maybe.
Yeah. For example, flanking is not an official thing in 5th edition. So knowing if your dungeon master is going to allow flanking or not can help you.
And I imagine it's probably difficult as a DM to list all those out, right? You probably can't possibly think of everything, so it's good to probably have questions.
Yeah, like I have a few house rules that I try to tell everybody ahead of time.
Sure, yeah. Are there any questions that are off limits? I imagine some of these might be obvious, like, you know, don't ask what the HP level of a certain, you know, creature is, but like anything that you try to say, hey, I'm not going to answer that, or, you know.
Yeah, there are things that I will not answer if I feel that they will affect the narrative or the surprise or the storyline. But I try to answer it in a way where they think I have answered it.
Okay, yeah, that's good. I'm sure it's probably obvious when people are asking questions in a manner that may be a little to gain an advantage as a player. But hopefully you don't encounter that.
There are times when you have to be like, okay, you can have the advantage. I'll just give them 50 more HP because they don't know.
That's true. That's true, yeah. Yeah, you want to reward your players, but if they're obviously trying to not play fair, maybe, then I don't think the point here is to exploit things. And very often, if I've had a rules question, I'm getting off subject here a little bit, and I've looked it up, I feel better knowing that the community at large usually will say things like, that rule's broken, or you could easily take advantage of that if you do that, so they usually direct it back to like bring it up to your DM if you want to use that spell because it can be problematic.
Yeah, and I have no problem if, you know, I make a ruling in the moment and then a player comes back like, hey, I did a little more research into it because I just wanted to see what the consensus was and this is what I found. And maybe I change how I rule it in the future. It doesn't change what's already happened, but in the future, you know, we can go another way with it.
I think that leads us really nicely into the next and final section, which is, you know, just some general advice, tips, tricks for being a DM. We've mentioned some already, but, you know, I'm sure there's a bunch.
The biggest tip I can give you is to just have fun. Work with your players, not against them. A lot of DMs in the past, and even today still, have this mindset of, I'm the DM, I am playing against the characters, like it's an adversarial thing.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the way to go. I think if you're just trying to kill their characters, there probably won't be a lot of enjoyment on the player side of the game. I think it's more important to have a grasp of the rules, but don't stress on the details. Make a ruling and go with it. And then if you realize you were wrong later, or maybe you made an error in judgment, just fix it for the future. Don't dwell on it. Don't feel guilty about it. It's all about fun for the table, for the players. I mean, it's a game when you come down to it. It's a game. Just have fun.
Yeah.
In terms of world building, and I've mentioned this before, I would say that you start small with a couple little things and just build up. For game prep, think about what the PCs want and what their backstory is. Think about how those play into the world that you have crafted or that you are playing in. And I try to do that for everybody. How and when it comes into play is what is going to be up for debate.
That's important, I think. Another little tie back into, I don't want to go as far to say as responsibilities per se. Every DM is different, but I do like that you bring up, that you make a point. The world is affected by their choices, and not only that, the encounters they're going to have are probably affected by personal bits from their backstory or things about their character.
I would say another thing you need to do as a DM is take what your players give you and kind of work it into the world. I guess that's kind of what we've been talking about a little bit.
Yeah.
There are innumerable options, and don't be limited by only what you can think of. Run with what your players give you and create from there. Inspiration comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. We talked about a lot of these internet resources on the last episode, but there are so many communities that are online now, especially for first-time DMs, that just use them. Dungeon mastering is something that I personally find very rewarding. However, I understand that it's also a fair bit of extra work and therefore not for everybody. Most of what you will do as a DM is pick up the pieces after the kids are done playing. It's a lot like herding cats.
Yeah.
And if that sort of thing is not your jam, I totally get it. Maybe just start out as a player, And if you're a group of players and nobody really wants to DM, there are resources online where you can find a dungeon master. Startplaying.games is an entire online, essentially classifieds or listing of DMs who are available to play games or who have games up online all over the world. There are DMs who have joined that, and it's only just really launched recently, and they've had hundreds of games played and booked already. And I'm on there too, so you can play a game that I have. Or, if you want to give it a try, just instead of making a big campaign, try a one-shot. A one-session game, just try it out and see if it's what you want to do. And you can choose to ignore certain rules, or you can homebrew new things, even in official modules. I certainly ignore and change things all the time.
I'll add a little bit to that. There's, in our Pathfinder game, our DM is still fairly new, I think, in trying some things. So one of the big things that he's had for us as players is to come to him with thoughts and maybe suggestions or feedback or whatever to help kind of shape what he does. And I think we're all adults, right? We're all like doing it. It's all constructive. No one's trying to make anyone feel bad. And I think that's kind of a nice little healthy relationship that he has as he's trying to get better at it himself. I know it's a big thing, like it's a big, for me even, I don't even know when I would DM if ever, because it just seems so, like, too much. But after today, I feel like I'm a little step closer to getting there.
Yeah, I think everybody should give it a shot, and maybe you don't like it after you do it, but you're never going to know until you actually try.
Yeah.
And honestly, I'm a control freak, so that's why I like doing it.
Well, there's plenty of people too that they like to not have that control and just want to be players. So I think that's great.
Yeah, and some people just want to play because it's a stress reliever and it's a way for them to escape. It's all therapy, and there ain't no shame in that.
Exactly. And part of the reason I brought up the feedback, and we talked about this too, right? Asking DM questions. It's just good to have that open flow. You mentioned it too, having a little 5-10 minute break after the session to make sure everyone's enjoying it. Any other tips or advice we've left out you'd like to throw in there?
Well, specifically if you're going to Dungeon Master, I would say just have a general idea of your story, and not in I want them to succeed in obtaining the Ruby of Karnak. That's very specific. More like, I want to see how these characters interact with the fact that there's a war going on. Or I want to tell a story of these characters who are in the middle of a bunch of islands where there are pirates all over the place. Maybe they conquer the pirates, maybe they join the pirates. So just run with an idea, keep it general, and be open to what the players bring.
That's great. I got nothing else. This has been very informative for me, hopefully for the listeners. And like you said, have fun.
Thank you all for joining us on this adventure, and come along with us next time as we delve into some more player options, feats. No, not the things on the bottom of your legs, but we'll talk about that next time. Remember to check out our friend and the composer of all the music used on Mid-Level Adventures, John D. Ivy, on SoundCloud.com. Please follow us on Twitter and Instagram at MidLVLAdventure.
And please check out our website on Wix at midleveladventurer.wixsite.com. And feel free to email us at midleveladventurers@gmail.com.
And as always, I'm Jarrod Jehoda.
And I'm Matt Morris.
And until then, mind the traps and keep adventuring.